Want to thank our sponsors, Micky Finn's, MPD Electric Cooperative, Carolina Bank, Pepsi of Florence. Another edition of No Stoplights. Drew McKissick, SCGOP chairman and co-chair of the National Party, is with us. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. Happy to be here, man. I mean, I'm fine as frog here.
Yeah, we don't have breaks to take in this thing, so we can ramble about. You're a man of many words. I'm a person of many words, so we'll see where this leads. First, I want people to get to know who Drew McKissick is.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they know you as a political official.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more to you than that.
Sure.
So give me kind of the cliff note of who you are, where you come from, and what you believe in.
Born and raised outside of Columbia. Lived there all my life, other than time down in Charleston, College of Charleston. Got involved in politics at a young age, from writing letters to the editor when I was in high school. I figured out I was a marginal student, let's say. I was the first person in history of my school that ever failed typing class, by the way. I had to take it over again in order to graduate. Government class was the first class I ever had that I was straight A's without cracking a book. And I thought, I need to do this for a living. So I ended up going to college, major in political science, get hooked up with college Republicans, young Republicans, run campaigns, worked in the Pat Robertson campaign back in 1988. That, got the bug, so to speak. Go forward from there, doing campaign work, grassroots lobbying work, organizing, then working with the party, and then with the groups and with the party. And, I've kind of worked inside and outside of the establishment, if you will, at different times. And as a friend of mine says, it's kind of like being outside the building, throwing rocks at the establishment, and then you're in the building, and then you're catching the rocks. So you see the problem from both sides, kind of. And I've got that gives me a little bit more well-rounded experience with who it is that we need to get engaged in what we're doing in order to be effective, in order to make a difference, which is at the end of the day why we're here, or we're just wasting our time. I've worked in that for 35 years now. Got all the way to 47 years old without managing to get married. So it took me 47 years to get all the good out of being single. Got married and found a wife who's willing to put up with this. We just had our 7th wedding anniversary back in June. And she had a note by the coffee maker that morning when I got up. It said, 3 home renovations, 4 campaigns for state chairman, 1 campaign for co-chairman, and 2 Boykin Spaniels. And I need a vacation. So she's put up with it. So she enjoys it. So, and I enjoy it thoroughly.
But politics gets in your blood, Drew.
It does.
I mean, it's intoxicating. It really and truly, it's, I've done a lot of things in my life, and politics got in my system, and I couldn't get it out of my system. You mentioned the word establishment.
Yep.
And I made notes, and I don't have any ironclad way of proceeding other than we'll kind of make it up as we go. But you're in a party today that has disagreements.
Sure.
About net negative, net positive of the establishment. First of all, from your perspective, what do you think of when I say political establishment?
Oh, good gosh. Yeah. 1,000 different definitions. Depends on who you're talking to at what point in time. I kind of make the joke about, people throw the term rhino around, and for a lot of folks, it seems to be rhinos or anybody who has been here 5 minutes longer than you have, or the establishment is anybody who's been here longer than you have. Well, all right. Yeah, you can make a case that a lot of the folks who are in office at any given place and time, are more responsible maybe for whatever the problems are than you are, but it doesn't mean they didn't get there for the same reason you did, wanting to try to change something. I think it's important that we also have a little bit of appreciation for the folks who have gone in to try to blaze a trail to make changes. Even in the Republican Party here in South Carolina, it didn't all get this way just when I walked on the scene. We've been steadily building for years. A lot of folks came before me at the state level, a lot of good folks at the county level who did a whole lot of hard work to get us where we are now. Have some of them occasionally been part of a problem? Yeah. Have a lot more of them done a whole lot of work to try to make changes? Yeah. When we get involved, we got to have a little bit of perspective and appreciation for who's there and what they've done, what they've helped to do. Rather than just be quick to think anybody, who was here before me is part of the problem. My attitude is, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for showing up. We got some work to do.
Is the opposite of establishment populism? Does populism by necessity threaten establishment?
No, I don't think so, because that would then presume that anybody who would have a quote populist viewpoint had not done anything to be a part of the establishment. Well, you've got some folks who are part of the political establishment who have populist points of view. Does that mean that they're a part of the problem? Well, no. So I think we can take labels a little bit too seriously sometimes. And I get it, labels are sort of political shorthand. We try to pigeonhole people here, there, and the other, and maybe makes it easier for us to, kind of understand the game and who's where and what seat they're sitting in and what they're trying to do. But, you can take that a little bit too far and let that color your thinking and, who you will or won't work with, and it might make you less productive.
I went and saw the movie several weeks back with my wife, Oppenheimer.
Saw that, yeah.
And it was a very intense 3 hours in a theater. Yep. But my takeaway from that was that there's an unbelievably brilliant man who understands things beyond my comprehension. Mm-hmm. But it's really about raw energy. Mm-hmm. And how do we harness or not this raw energy? Do we take this scientific breakthrough and contribute to the betterment of mankind or not? Mm-hmm. The Manhattan Project came out of that. Hiroshima, Nagasaki came out of that. The end of a war came out of that. But right. Many thousands of people were basically vaporized from the planet. I'm not equating populism to the splitting of an atom, but there is a rawness about populism. There is an uncontrollability about populism. Is it your job to try and not put populism in its place, but to harness that energy, integrate it into a political party, and effectively win elections?
I think part of what sometimes you can define as populism, or people who would think of themselves as populists, people you might call populists, are just, folks who have become disconnected from, what we would think of as the establishment, or from folks who may be in leadership, and disconnected in the sense that either the folks that are there now are not really addressing everything that they care about. I've talked about this before, I think just using the example of, when Trump first ran back in 2016, and the fact that the Beltway crowd, if you will, Republican and Democrat, who had gotten so far away from the American public, Republicans who had gotten away from the base in terms of where they were on immigration, on globalism, et cetera. So I think a lot of the folks who would fit in that populist category would be folks who would say, those folks aren't talking about those issues. And, the first candidate who does, and in a way that's, effective and authentic and, stays on message, cuts through with that crowd. Does that mean that those folks don't also believe other things that are part of what we would think of as tenets of conservatism or the Republican platform? No. I think, they're folks who are, we would think of as Christian conservatives sitting in a Baptist church somewhere who are also, touched off by those issues. And you got other folks who you might think of as, more moderate Republicans, but who care a whole lot about immigration and so forth, because how much money it costs this country. So the categories aren't always as neat as we like to think that they are. And sometimes, that just makes this job a little bit more difficult, because you can't have the shorthand all the time.
But you would agree, I think, that it's turned the Republican Party into this weird coalition. At times, I think I understand it. At other times, I'm like, no, I don't fully understand it. Mm-hmm. I have historically believed as a Republican that the Democrats were the pro-worker party. Labor unions and minimum wage was a big issue to them.
Yeah, right.
Is there an evolution in the Republican Party? Forget populism for a second. When it comes to policy initiatives and where the priorities are going to be, is this party going to advocate for, I guess, in essence, the American working class? And if so, how do we do that?
Well, I think you're going to see, and you are seeing, have been seeing, the Republican Party evolve some in terms of, or rather, the base of support of the Republican Party. That's a better way to put it. Excuse me. The base of support of the Republican Party has evolved into a more working class oriented party than it used to be, because of two things, primarily: the issues that the Republican Party and conservatives within the party talk about, how they talk about them, and also the evolution of the Democrat Party and the way that they have moved toward more of what we consider elites and global elites and wokeism and everything that's put it all on steroids and so forth for the last 10 years and 5 years. So I think it's more of a thing of the base of the support of the party changing than it is the party changing to try to attract different crowds or the other. I think that crowd is becoming more attracted by messages that they're hearing being articulated. It's like, I use the example of, kind of when you got you get a new puppy, and eventually you figure out when the puppy's laying over on its back, eventually when it gets comfortable enough to be where it is, and it'll lay on its back and sleep, or whatever. And you can find that spot on its belly and you scratch it and that back leg starts to kick like that. You got to find the thing that really sets people off, that find that where's that itch that needs to be scratched. And you've got more of the working class Americans, I think, that are getting their itch scratched by what they're hearing from Republicans. And that's then, the center of gravity begins to, move a little bit, and other folks are attracted by what they're hearing. I think there's still more room for growth on that side. You're going to see more of that. And again, I think it is being pushed more by what you're seeing from the Democrat side of the aisle. It is repelling those people. It's kind of like the, two north poles of a magnet repelling one another. And that's been, again, I think, just sort of amped up on steroids here over the course of the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, it's not just what we have thought about and talked about, you and I have talked about a lot, is economically populist issues. Let's talk about the debt. Let's talk about immigration, talk about globalism and trade. Now we're talking about, whether or not, parents ought to be notified if, your boy wants to have something cut off his body somewhere or something like that. I mean, stuff, again, you wouldn't have taken a bet 5 years ago that we'd be talking about now. This has just gone completely off the rails. And I think that's why you see politics now become so vitriolic and so confrontational, because the stuff we're arguing over now is not within the margins anymore. It's fundamental stuff.
And a debate that we're having within mine and your party. I mean, and I go back to Trump showing up. I mean, I think you and I talked off the air. From where I come from, it was pretty easy to see Trump coming. Yeah. The working class, rural America, right. Some of the right. Some of the declining opportunities that were afforded those people, and they felt a bit left behind. Mm-hmm. And they felt the Republican Party, okay, they've advocated for some of my social issues, but economically, I'm not sure they've had my best interests at heart. So when Trump shows up, and then people ask me about his stances, and I said, look, I'm not sure where he stands on a lot of things. But he says things that I think need to be said about immigration, trade, and China. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand it gets a lot more complicated than that. But where are we as a party in agreeing to disagree on immigration, trade, and China? Where do we go? I mean, obviously, you just mentioned how radical the left has become. Mm-hmm. And I don't think every Democrat's crazy. Right. But I think some of those liberals have really taken control of a party and offered up some pretty radical proposals. Mm-hmm. But when it comes back to America first, and that's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's let's address China in a way that advantages the working class, immigration and trade. So walk me through, as a party official, what you think your responsibility is to help navigate that complex debate.
Well, everybody's got a different role to play in politics. You've got elected officials, and you've got what I would call party mechanics. I'm a mechanic. So my job is not necessarily to be, the mouthpiece who's trying to bring people into the fold. Now, not that I don't have those conversations. I do. That's not my primary job. My primary job is working behind the scenes to put together the infrastructure that needs to be in place to build what I would call the generic Republican get out the vote machine, so that whoever Republicans at large decide to nominate for office, which is the most important thing a party can do, is choose someone to represent them on the ballot in November. And we do that. And part of our job is putting together the process to make that happen. That's what we're doing at the national level right now with all the 50 different states, doing whether it's presidential primaries or caucuses, and what the rules are going to be and how it's all going to work. Standing back, letting people pick the candidate, pick the horse, because if we get involved, then it's going to be hard to put it all back together again, once we got a nominee. But in the meantime, doing what I call, and I have this conversation oftentimes, let's say, with major donors. So as RNC co-chair now, every other day I'm on the phone calling people from California to wherever who might give, $40,000 and $50,000 checks or whatever. And we'll have these conversations, some that absolutely don't want one candidate or the other, or absolutely are going to be with this one no matter what. How do I bridge that gap? And we have these conversations. And part of what I have to do is explain, look, no matter who our candidate is, at that level, the presidential level, and on down, they're all going to want a party that is healthy enough to help get out the vote whenever they're on the ballot in November. They're all going to want to make sure we got the infrastructure in place. We've hired and trained staff in the different states around the country that are going to be key in a presidential race. You think of, like we could probably take a bet right now, bet our house on how 42 states are going to vote. 8 of them where that presidential race is going to be decided most likely. Senate races that are key and in the balance, some congressional races, but the party's job, when you think, this is part of the problem, and you encounter this, I know, doing your show all the time, because everybody's not a political activist and a junkie.
Most aren't.
Thank the Lord. They're not. People out there doing productive stuff, right? So when they think of the Republican Party, who knows what they're thinking about that given point in time? They might be thinking about something some elected official said or did that made them happy or made them mad, usually that made them mad. And, the party needs to fill in the blank. Okay, were you talking about some elected official? Are you talking about the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the National Republican Congressional Committee, the Republican National Committee, the state GOP, the county GOP? All are different organizations, none of which are accountable to the other. We all have different roles in doing our thing. So when you're talking to me specifically as a state party chairman and as co-chairman of the RNC, that comes with a very specific job. My job is to build the infrastructure to make sure that we are able to turn out the vote and do what I call the unsexy work of politics. It is the work that people usually don't pay attention to unless it doesn't get done. Then they're paying attention to it. Well, y'all weren't able to do so-and-so and get out the vote and da-da-da-da. Well, and when we mess up, you're right. When we do our job right, the candidates will take credit for one great campaign they ran. So our job is to do the unsexy work.
And it's not to decide where the party is on China or where the party is on immigration. Is it fair to say your job is to, once the party's leaders decide, once the elected officials decide, this is where we believe we need to be on China, immigration, trade, then you help facilitate the logistical advantages that lead to successful elections? And we've got a platform. Okay, state party, we've got a platform. That is formulated how, Drew? Yeah. I hate to interrupt you, but how does that party platform become reality?
All right, so at the state level, we do that at our state convention, once every so many years. The state party chairman, the last time we did it was about 3 years ago. I appointed a platform committee of about 15 people who are representative of the party around the state, who've been in the party a long time. They get together, looked at the platform we had, they suggest changes, the state convention adopts that. At the national party level, it's a little more complicated. Each state around the country, when we go to have the national convention in Milwaukee next year, the week before everything that happens you'll see on TV, a platform committee will meet. It is composed of one man and one woman from each state and territory around the country. Okay, so you'll have 112 people, I believe is the number, who will be the platform committee for the Republican National Convention. So when we elect our national delegates at our state convention next May, we'll elect 52 delegates total. 2 of those people will be on the platform committee from South Carolina. They'll go up there a week in advance. They'll be presented with a draft of ideas that have been put together based on the existing platform, suggested changes, some issues that, again, we wouldn't have taken a bet we'd be talking about today, like transgender, this, that, and whatever. We probably need something in there about that now. We need to address that. And, and then we got the issue on trade and China and so forth. Where are we now? What does it say before? How do we all feel about this now? And of course, then by that time, you probably have a presumptive nominee. So this happens before we actually officially nominate somebody at the convention. Odds are mathematically you get to that point and it's going to be this person or this person, usually. Their campaign begins to put a bug in the people's ears who are on the platform committee, so to speak. Well, a candidate really feels this way about this and that. Sometimes that colors the language. Sometimes it doesn't. Famously back in 1996, Robert Dole had no appetite for platform stuff whatsoever. And when he didn't like what the platform committee was going to do, he's like, well, they can do what they want to, and I'm going to do what I want to. That's basically in Bob Dole-esque fashion. That's exactly what he said. Fine. But the platform applies not just to presidential campaigns, but we got congressional races, Senate races and stuff. This is what the National Republican Party, how it feels about these issues at large. And then it'll be adopted by the full convention.
In that spirit, and here's where I think you and I probably disagree a little bit, and that's fine. I believe that the party that we like to see in power has an almost asymmetrical relationship between those who fund the party, those who pay the bills that the party incurs to do all these things, helping win elections, and where the base is. I mean, we're spending a lot of time, and it's good for business. I mean, I do a radio show. It's good for business to talk about this asymmetrical relationship. You don't believe that. You don't believe. You think there's some disagreement there, but it's not asymmetrical. But I think you would agree, and I think the numbers clearly show this. We need the establishment on board. We need the America Firsters on board. I'll leave that certain personality out of this. And there seems to be a complexity there that has not historically existed.
Well, now I wouldn't go so far as to say it hadn't historically existed. But a couple things. One, as someone who talks to donors on a regular basis, from the $100 donors up to the people who write a $100,000 check, I can tell you there's disagreement within that group of people.
They're not a monolith.
They are not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination. And different issues tickle different folks, funny bone. Now, people who can write really big checks usually come to the ability to write really big checks because they got a fairly similar life experience in working in business and so forth. So they've got things that they spent more time dealing with and might be a little bit more important to them because of where they've been able to get to in life, and what they've got to protect, and what they think about. And, but as we think of, again, this is where labels become a problem for us. When we think of the establishment as only being people who give money, you got a lot of grassroots activists who are part of the establishment too, who've been there for a long time and worked in the party for a long time. So it's not, again, as monolithic and easy to label, but, on the whole, if you want to say more donors maybe care more about a certain set of issues than just, Joe Blow who's out here on his tractor on the weekend who happens to consider himself a Republican, sometimes that's true, That doesn't mean they disagree necessarily all the time or even most of the time. But what it does mean is they've got different priorities. And priorities really come down to what's hitting you in the face on a daily basis. I mean, what's the last pothole I ran over, or the last, bad conversation I had with my accountant because of some regulation that got changed somewhere or whatever. Those life experience, and what people run into on a daily basis. And that's why we come back to what are our basic principles? And that's just what's got us.
One of the issues, and having run as a Republican, was the lack of diversity in the people I believe I could attract to cast a ballot in my favor. Frustrated me. I mean, I knew I had so much in common with African-American voters and Hispanic voters and working class voters, but for whatever reason, they had an almost irrational loyalty to the other party. It frustrated me. It discouraged me, to be honest with you. Is that part of your responsibility to create a more diverse and more welcoming and more successful party, because the country's changing?
Part of what we do, and again, this goes back to affecting the mechanics. So part of the focus is helping to engage with people who don't necessarily consider themselves a Republican, to help them see our message and what we care about and how it impacts their life, and try to draw them in to be part of what we're putting together, help support campaigns or, early voting, et cetera. So yes, a couple things. So I worked for 2 election cycles, in the 14 and 16 cycle, doing faith engagement for the RNC from, Maine down to Florida, out to Arkansas, working with pastors and churches to try to get folks, engaged, registered to vote for one thing. A lot of folks sitting in church on Sunday ain't registered to vote. A huge percentage. Out of every, way you could slice up the American public, the biggest piece of the pie that is a latent giant is the percentage of people sitting in churches on Sunday who aren't registered to vote or don't vote.
Wow.
If a third of them that aren't engaged were to actually get engaged at any given point in time, it'd be a political earthquake.
Do we know why they become so politically inactive?
It's not that they have become, it's that they have not been active. Okay. I mean, and again, I've had churches where, pastors would say, well, no, 90% of the people in my church are registered to vote and so forth. And then we would go and say, all right, well, you can get a copy of your, registry of members for the church, and we'll bump it against the voter registration file and find out 20% of them are, huge percentages of them. And then what percentage don't vote? Half the people who are registered don't vote in the average election, and the average election is won or lost by 5% of the vote. By the time you get down to the local races, the number of people who are picking who's in leadership in a lot of levels around this country is less than, sometimes, 1 out of 5 or less, 1 out of 10 in some cases. where you get school board races that are held at odd times. You know, the turnout's real low, and so the number of people who voted for the winner is mighty small. So just the potential impact that's actually sitting out there is tremendous. Now, when you talk about, say, African-American voters or Hispanic voters who have a lot in common with us from a working, man standpoint, you're talking about, working people type agenda. Very impacted by immigration, folks who are able to come in across the border and work for cash under the table and, outbid them on a job essentially, or, undercut them. That hurts them financially. One of the biggest groups of folks that we've had in the last several years who've been involved in pushing back against illegal immigration have been Hispanics who came in the country legally. They've got more to lose, and folks in the black community. And I think that's part of what has hurt, the Biden administration politically is you've seen the last couple of elections, what has happened, and Trump, for instance, in 2020, got a bigger percentage of the black vote than any Republican has gotten nationally since Richard Nixon. Now, did you hear a lot about that? No. But what's that telling you? Again, those issues are starting to cut with a lot of the folks in the African-American community around the country. And as you point out, they have been previously so monolithically Democrat. 9 out of 10, or better, votes in a typical campaign would go to the Democrat candidate from the black community. And they have become so over-reliant on huge percentages of minority voters to the point where if they begin to lose a couple of points off of that, they're going to be in trouble. And again, our job, part of it is going to them and so and explaining how what we believe in matters to them. So from the RNC perspective, mechanically, we've got, 35 to 40 community centers that we will be funding and did in the last cycle and will again this cycle to a greater degree in targeted areas around the country. So I just went to the opening for RNC Community Center in McAllen, Texas, like a mile from the border. We've got a congresswoman elected down there, first Republican in over 150 years in the last cycle, trying to hang on to that seat. So you've got a lot of, Hispanic churches who will come in and do stuff in those community centers and talk about voter registration and engagement. We got some inner cities around the country where we will be standing those up. So going and taking the message to people who should be aligned with us and helping demonstrate to them how we are. You don't have to win them all, but you begin to chip away at that percentage when the other guys are reliant or just so overly reliant on it and taking them for granted, by the way. It begins to make a big difference mathematically.
Let's go down that road for a second. You mentioned some of these swing states, some of these independent voters, some of these people that have historically not voted Republican. One of our front runners says the election was stolen. I refuse to say that. I think there were statistical anomalies that are hard to comprehend. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a diplomatic way of saying a certain thing. But there's no question that the $450 million Zuckerberg invested was money well spent. Maybe the most consequential dollars in the history of American elections.
Right.
That was in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have to say to Republican voters and supporters or candidates who want to be encouraged that that's not going to happen again? What have we done to combat that, answer that, respond to that? What would you agree with my analysis that money was unbelievably important in the 2020 presidential election?
Zuckerberg's money, yes, had a big impact, no doubt about it. So a couple things. So after the 2020 election, the RNC appointed a election integrity committee, to go and look at what happened, where did it happen, why did it happen, and make suggestions on what we need to change from an organizational standpoint, what we need to try to get changed from a legislative standpoint, and what we need to challenge legally. And to put those recommendations together. I was on that task force. And after, 6 or 8 months, fast forward to the South Carolina General Assembly session in 21, when we passed our election integrity bill here. Now, we didn't have the problems here in South Carolina they had in a lot of other states around the country. That didn't mean we couldn't tighten up the laws we had to make sure that we never had those problems, because what we were not was the focus of a lot of that type of activity. They focused that on a lot of what you would think of as presidential battleground states, which we're obviously not. But again, didn't mean that if we ever didn't, might have gotten targeted with that kind of activity that couldn't have a bigger impact. So we tightened up our laws. We drew up, I want to say it was about 17 recommendations or something like that. And other groups like Heritage Foundation and so forth had similar recommendations. At the end of the day, I sat down with leadership here in the General Assembly. And we had several bills that we put together because we were kind of concerned legislatively that if we had too much stuff in the bill, it might go down, So, but at the end of the day, there was enough, grassroots propulsion behind getting something done that we were able to get, I think, 17 or 16 of those items into that one bill. I think Heritage, I believe, rates South Carolina's new election law as the third most conservative or safe, secure in the country. Okay, so we did our job here. We don't control every state in the country legislatively. A lot of states, either legislatively or via regulation, made changes to their election laws. Some changes were made legally, some were extra legally, some were by judicial fiat, where you had judges get involved. And we ended up having problems. How do we fix that going forward? So again, places where we control the legislature, we worked to make changes here in South Carolina. Georgia did the same thing, with their election laws about 4 or 5 months prior to us doing so here.
Working with Republican majorities.
Yes, exactly. So where we can work with the majority and get stuff done, we've done that. Where we have lawsuits that we can bring to make changes, we've done. I think currently, right now, the RNC itself, not counting third-party conservative groups and so forth, the RNC is engaged in over 50 lawsuits right now around the country about election laws in different places. Okay, so we are being super litigious because that's what this is coming to in this country now. So okay, if that's going to be the rules of the game, all right, we'll play. So bringing lawsuits where we need to try to change stuff, defending where we need to defend things that they're trying to do. Okay. And then you have what can we do internally, mechanically, to account for all of this, to try to make sure that the election is safe, secure, and that we win at the end of the day. So that comes down to the biggest thing that we have done has been the rolling out what we call the Bank Your Vote program, which will be a one-stop shop and a funnel, if you will, to catch anybody around the country who, the mechanics of it will be signing a pledge to vote early and beat Joe Biden. They do that, depending on what state they're in, they're going to get tagged, with follow-up emails and so forth for this is the election laws in your state. This is when, where, and how you can vote early in your state and have an impact. And that's different in California than it is here in South Carolina. They've got ballot harvesting out there. They've got drop boxes out there. Those are illegal here, thank the Lord. But, until we can change what the laws are in South Carolina, we got to play by the rules of the game or we're going to sit there and lose again. So in California, for instance, piggybacking on what we just talked about a minute ago, community centers. So we've turned Republican community centers in California to places with drop boxes. We've worked with conservative Hispanic churches in California to have election drop boxes in those churches because, folks, they trust their pastor. They can leave their ballot at the church. So, it's a matter of making adjustments to whatever the laws are in those respective states to maximize our vote because especially in those key states, if we don't expand our voter pool, we are not going to win. We mathematically have to turn out more people, reach down into what I would call low propensity Republicans, that you got the folks who are going to crawl across broken glass to go vote on election day, what we call the 4 out of 4 voters. They voted every time that the polls are open. And then you got the folks you got to poke with a sharp stick a couple of times to get them to turn out at the polls. Those are the folks we have to be focusing on now and to get them to turn out, pledge to vote early, and just utilize whatever rules that are in place to our advantage.
This is such an improper way to ask the question, but I don't know any other way, and I'm pretty improper. Is it fair? I understand what we've done to address the issue in states controlled by Republican General Assemblies. That's a pretty easy fix.
Right.
But when you get to Pennsylvania, when you get to some of these other states, in other words, is the Republican Party today ready to fight fire with fire in Pennsylvania, in Fulton County, Georgia, in Maricopa County? You talked a second ago about, the churchgoer not being as politically active as you would expect them to be. I got to believe that a lot of people who make faith as a big part of their life just don't want to be a part of that. It's so nasty and vitriolic to use your word. But are we as a party ready to fight fire with fire in some of these places that appear to be ballot harvesting and unsolicited mail-in ballot, chain of custody? I could go on and on, and you know the language better than I do. But I think our viewers and listeners would want to know that the RNC is committed to being as aggressive in combating those issues in those places that we weren't in 2020.
Right. Absolutely. 100%. We are light years ahead of where we were in 20 right now. and ahead of
Drew,
where we
we
were in
caught off
22.
guard in 20. I mean, did we expect what happened to happen?
No,
and I'm not saying the election was stolen. I don't have any idea. But I do know that things happen in some places that are hard to explain.
I think, COVID threw everybody for a loop, and Democrats used COVID as an opportunity to change election laws, to game the system. Again, a few places legislatively, more often bureaucratic or judicial fiat. Essentially, not changing the rules the way you're supposed to change the rules, and using, an emergency as a reason to do that. And then when you add to that, you pointed out Mark Zuckerberg and all the money he showered on local county election commissions that just happened to be Democrat counties so they could do more getting people registered to vote. Oh, wow, that's nice. Well, he just wants to give money to government and help them do their job. Well, 99 out of 100 places that he spent money were Democrat-run counties, Coincidence? Probably not. You have a lot of states, though, including ours, that passed a ban on any outside money coming in to fund county election commissions and government in general. But yes, are we better off? Are we prepared to fight fire with fire? Yes, because again, I think it goes back to three things: legislative, judicial, legal, and then organizational. As I pointed out, legally, we're engaged in over 50 lawsuits. You got other groups out there, Center for, Election Integrity, run by a great outfit and a great lawyer there named Cleta Mitchell. You've got other outside groups, like Ken Cuccinelli runs one, and some others that take on specific lawsuits around the country, and either sometimes defensive, sometimes offensive. And then you've got what's happening legislatively where it can, working with great state legislators at the local level around the country. But then you've got the places where you don't control it and you can't necessarily sue your way out of it. All right, these are the rules. How can we exploit these rules to go win in this play? And I'll point out, by the way, using 22 as an example and to answer your question, nobody a year ago would have bet real money that it would have been California and New York that would have provided the margin in new House seats to give Republicans a majority in the House of Representatives. And that's what happened. How did we do that in California? Just like I was talking about a minute ago. Ballot harvesting, drop boxes, the early mail-in ballots and so forth, especially in the religious, conservative Hispanic community. Up in New York, some of the same thing. So, I think we were slow to catch on to that game. And part of it is and I get the hesitance, don't get me wrong, of folks within our own base. So, I just want to vote on election day. I believe everybody ought to vote on election day, none of this early voting stuff, et cetera, et cetera. In an ideal world, yes, you are right. And I'll point out one of the most conservative states in the country when it comes to, that sort of a regime for voting is Delaware. They don't even have absentee voting in Delaware. You got to vote on election day. Joe Biden's home state, but are they out there saying that, Delaware is, violating people's rights and blah, 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 and they're a bunch of bigots because this is their election law? No, they don't do that. Well, go figure. But, are we ready now to double down on what it takes with what the rules are and exploit them until they get changed? Because we're not going to change them unless we win. And I'll point out, a lot of candidates have been, of the sort that they would echo that we only ought to vote on election day. We don't want to do early voting. But what are you hearing now? Now you're hearing all the Republican candidates point out the need for early voting. We've had from President Trump down to, I think, 5 other candidates have already done videos for the RNC for our Bank the Vote programs. And get your vote in early, because they want to win and they know the math. You brought up President Trump, so I'm going to go down this road with you. And I mean, that there's a documentary on Netflix about the Eagles. And the Eagles were kind of known as somewhat of a crossover. Are they country? Are they folk? Are they rock? We don't know what they are. But they wanted to be a rock and roll band. Right. So they went and hired Joe Walsh to be their lead guitarist. And Glenn Fry famously says in the documentary, and we got all of him. I mean, we got a kick-ass rock and roll guitarist, but we got a guy who set the tour bus on fire and tore up hotel rooms and all these other sorts of things. In other words, you can't just get this everything Joe Walsh. That goes with it. You got to get everything that goes with him, and the rest, as we say in Pamplico in Paris, is histoire. But no, I mean, he fundamentally changed that band forever, and it became one of the iconic rock and roll bands. Hotel California is kind of an anthem of my generation. Yep. Well, I mean, you don't get Trump without all of Trump. Sure.
It cuts both ways, but there's no doubt about it. And I'm not defending everything he's never done. I'm not condoning everything he's ever done. He is a very unique political actor. I mean, he's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I do believe we've crossed the Rubicon in allowing the indicting of a former president, current frontrunner of a major political party. You're not with the DOJ. You're not with the Trump campaign, but you are a well-regarded person responsible for making sure the Republican Party is properly represented and gets its fair shake. What do you make of the fact that we've never had an American president indicted, and now we've got one who's been indicted not once, not twice, but not 3 times, but
4 times.
But 4 times. I could use a Lionel Richie analogy, 3 times a lady, but it's 4 times an indictment there. But seriously, I mean, I'm not asking to advocate nor defend Trump, but what do you make of that crossing of the Rubicon?
Well, a couple things. One, what we're seeing without a doubt is a two-phase system of justice in this country. Okay, one for people who have one set of opinions and one for people who
is that radical anymore to say that? I mean, normally when an RNC official says that, wow, that's pretty radical there.
The fact that it's not radical for me to say that tells you a little bit about where we are in the country right now. I mean, it's unfortunate to have to say that, definitely. And you've got an administration. Even bigger than that, you've got a party, you've got a liberal movement in general, a progressive movement like they call themselves, that are using extra political means to try to accomplish their ends. Now, this is the logical end point, if it is the end point, and it may not be. It'll probably go further before it's all over with. But if you look at where they've come over the years, you can easily see how they got here. I mean, first it was, trying to use the national government as a way to change policies at the state level around the country when they couldn't win state legislatures everywhere. So, let's just make that outgrowth of national policy, and so you end up with what you're talking about Thomas Jefferson being one of your heroes earlier. What Jefferson talked about, the national government pressing all the states down into one consolidated mass. At one point. That's where we've come now. Everything that's a state issue can be a national issue if you've got somebody who can get a regulation passed or a law passed to make it that way, and then try to, because they can't win locally in most legislatures around the country. Then you move on from that to what we see with when they can't win political battles, they go to court, and then they get new rights invented. And so we're trying to change policy via judicial fiat now, and then you move forward from that. And you get to where we are now, which is using the justice system to, defeat candidates you can't always defeat, or movements you can't defeat, or to put them, behind the 8 ball, politically speaking, for the next election, to try to, liberalism in general has a history in our country of ignoring or getting around political impediments by any means necessary. And that's more of what you're seeing now. And you're going to, in my opinion, you'll continue to see more of it. And the byproduct of that, though, is what they have to worry about. What's the political, result of that? I think Biden, Democrats in general, are going to have a problem with now having turned 2 standards of justice into an issue. Because these are the people who are seeing this. Are the same folks who are also watching, what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop, and now what we found out, Joe Biden sent 5,400 emails to, his son now whenever he was vice president about when and where he was going and what he was doing and so forth, while, his son was trying to sell access to folks in other countries and so forth. And, on the other hand, over here, you've got what they're, accusing the former president of. Start to weigh all. I mean, I guess Biden's biggest mistake was he didn't have a server in his bathroom like Hillary that he could take a hammer to, or use bleach bit on or whatever. All of this now is going to look like 2 standards for people. It's going to be a political issue in this coming campaign. And it gets down to an issue of fairness. So set all the other political issues aside, general conservative principles, liberal principles, etc. Let's talk about, the average guy who's just sitting out there is kind of weighing which way he's going to go, and he's not really politically invested in any different ideology or whatever. What looks fair? Does that look fair? I think fairness is going to be an issue in this upcoming campaign. The Democrats are helping, I think, to turn it into an issue.
Is it a money play? I mean, do you see this? You're an operative. You'd be an insider. whether you like it or not. I guess to some degree I'd be an operative and an insider, and I damn sure don't like it. But is this the ability? Is there the interest by one side to drain the other side of the assets it takes to be effective in competing in a nationwide campaign?
100%. I mean, because now you're having to pay to defend yourself in 4 different legal venues.
And that number could be what, Drew? I mean, it could be, I think he spent $60 million.
Before it's over with, tens of millions. And, notice the timing of these lawsuits and when you will have to go to court in these different cases, I think is almost hits back to back to back, month to month to month in the spring. What's happening in the spring? The nomination contest, before we get to the convention in the summer. It is all, no reasonable person is going to look at that. Even, people who hate Donald Trump or hate any Republican or whatever could look at that and reasonably say, well, that's probably kind of conveniently timed. Yeah. I mean, or not think that. I mean, yes, 100%, totally coordinated and, for political purposes. One, for whatever they think that it would do to a particular candidate from a messaging standpoint and public perception. And then 2, what it'll do to them from just basic raw resources to run a campaign. I mean, it's a new front, essentially, that has been opened up now in national campaigning. It's all right, well, what do we need to do to put this guy behind the legal 8 ball and make him have to spend resources over here so he can't spend it over here? And that's what they're doing.
Last question, and this will be an interesting conclusion. It's a competitive nation. I mean, it's a divided nation. Sure. As much as I don't understand it, one half of the nation disagrees with me. I think I've got all the right answers to all the issues. Yeah, I mean, roughly half of the nation thinks I'm crazy. But stick with me for a second. It's not going to come down to South Carolina. It's not going to come down to New York and California and Wyoming and Montana.
Right.
It's going to come down to what states and how do the Republicans win those 5 or 6 states, win those 250, 400,000 Seinfeld watchers. Is that something you focus on, pay attention to day and night?
Sure.
And are we working toward, how to compete in those states that will decide who the next president is?
100%. Yes. I mean, the primary job of the RNC is to be the national committee that comes together to win the White House, help that nominee win the White House. And then from that, we also work to help Senate committee and the congressional committee win federal races, and then help state parties to make sure they have the resources to be competitive where they need to. So all those things kind of flow from one another. But again, as I pointed out earlier, we could sit here and bet the mortgage on how 42 states are going to vote. We're going to see all kind of presidential candidates between February 24th, and after February 24th, we ain't going to see another one for 4 years or 8 years, depending on what happens. And if we do, we got bigger problems. I mean, if they got to spend money in South Carolina, then, just I don't know, Katie bar the door. But you've got about 8 of them, and we can sit here and name them. Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. You'll have New Mexico, Nevada, places like that.
Georgia, swing state.
To a degree. And Virginia, hey, we got a great new governor in Virginia now, who, by the way, I think would also be someone worthy of consideration to be somebody's running mate, because put Virginia's 13 electoral votes back into play. We hadn't won them in 12 years now or something. That's huge. You got to get to 270 to win, So when you start to look around at those states, those are the places where we will be spending most of our resources, period. And doing things like we talked about earlier, the early voting program, bank your vote. That's going to be critical, expanding the voting pool in those states. If we don't expand the voting pool in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, Minnesota or other places like that will work, then we're not going to win. We got to expand the voting pool. And so we are totally 100% focused on trying to help state parties in those places get up to speed and do what they need to do in the meantime, because like I pointed out earlier, the candidates are going to be doing their thing, running for the nomination. That's not our job. Our job is to sit out here and do the behind-the-scenes stuff to build enough of the infrastructure and the mechanics of all this so that when we got a nominee, they're ready to take advantage of what we've done. It's almost like we're out there building the highway, and then so they got something they can run their car on. And that's where we'll be spending 90% of our time.
Drew, I misled you. I said that was the last question. I got one last question. It's not a question as much as it is something I've tried to study
like
and
Columbo
consider.
Now. Just one more thing,
right,
man.
Right.
One more thing.
You're mine. You admitted you agreed to be mine, so you're mine for a little while. And I hear a lot about headwinds. From my days in office and my days of covering we're losing young voters. We're losing female voters. We're losing Hispanic and African-American voters. Yeah. The one tailwind I think we have is reapportionment. The 232 that Trump got is 235 today. Yeah. The 235 could be 240 or 41 because of the mass exodus from these major American cities that are democratically governed. Right. I've read 232 could be 238. So you put George in the column. It's a very, I'm not saying it's a shoe-in. It's certainly not that. But the one thing we have done is I think put Florida in our column. Ohio's in our column. 232 becomes 235. There seems to still be a mass exodus from liberal American cities to red states, and they're not bringing their voting proclivities, it seems. It is conservatives who are frustrated with that sort. I'm not asking you a question there, but is that a reality, and is that in our favor?
100%, and yes. I mean, blue states are getting bluer, red states are getting redder. Okay, so I get every state party around the country gets an update to what we call a new mover file about 3 or 4 times a year.
New mover file.
Yeah, known Republican movers.
How am I left off that?
So in other words, that tells me that they'll send us a list and say, these are the known Republicans who have moved to your state since X point in time. And they're not yet registered to vote. Y'all need to go get them registered. So we'll take that file, we'll cut it up by House district, by Senate district, send it to our elected officials. Hey, you need to send these guys a postcard, tell them how to register to vote. That's low-hanging fruit, And I have asked for, and I've seen a breakdown of state by state around the country, shaded blue or shaded red, depending on whether it's a place more Democrats are moving to or Republicans. And red states are getting redder, blue states are getting bluer. And I don't see that trend stopping because you have, as you point out, Republicans living in California going, heck with this, and they're leaving, taking their money with them. Same thing from New York and so forth. You look at all the people who moved into Horry County. I mean, somebody that used to do some economic development work with state government told me one time, you can draw a line about, say 40 miles north of Charleston, everything from there up to the North Carolina border, blue collar retirees, everything from there down to Hilton Head, white collar retirees, most of them Republican. And same thing up around Greenville and and Lake Oconee and up in that area, places that used to be solid Democrat, solid Republican today. A lot of new people from other places. So you have that element of that. That's working in our favor. Eventually that works in our favor when reapportionment, as you point out, when, different states pick up more electoral votes, like we got 1 more 10 years ago. So instead of 8, we've got 9 now. But you've also got, the issue of, as we talked about earlier, these different groups of people who have been taken for granted for a long time by the Democrat Party that are, on a percentage basis, they're still voting Democrat on balance. Not as much as they used to. And, when you talk about winning a state by 50,000 votes out of several million cast, that's a big deal. Again, look at Michigan, look at Wisconsin, how close those places were last time. We've got Hispanic votes. I mean, again, in 2020, we got more votes from the African-American community and the Hispanic community than any time since Richard Nixon. That's huge. And so, but for the people who will say, we're losing young votes and we're losing, usually the one I get the most is young people. Well, we need to get more young people voting Republican. You can go back in time all the way back to the 70s and you can find Pew polls that show the breakdown, age breakdown of, they consider themselves Republican or Democrat. And back then they were saying Republicans aren't winning enough young people. We got to win more young people. Well, what happens? Young people become old people. They get married. They get a job. They wonder who FICA is and why he's taking all their money. And they look at stuff like they have kids and they start going to church. These things that life happens to people, and they get more conservative. And that's been the same as today as it was back in the 70s. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need to work to try to get more young people. We do. But I'm saying a lot of this is life oriented.
That's very well explained. Appreciate your time.
Yes, sir.
And that's
happy to be here.
I'm a man of my word. The second time. Not as much as the first. Drew McKissick, SCGOP chairman and co-chair of the National Party, agreed to sit with us for longer than he probably imagined. But thank you nonetheless. Do want to remind our viewers and listeners of our sponsors: Micky Finn's, MPD Electric, Carolina Bank, Pepsi of Florence. Micky Finn's comes to mind on this Labor Day weekend. I tell people the Jefferson's bourbon. It'll make you want to quote the Declaration of Independence. The first sip will make you want to play. The fourth or fifth glass, you begin to kind of hear those bells of freedom ring. that Jeffersonians like to think about. We'll get together one of these days and talk about Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian government.
Yes, sir.
That'll be another interesting. Thank you, my friend. Good seeing you.
Fantastic.
We'll get out of here.